Across the far north of Roman Britain, beyond the walls that once marked the edge of empire, lived a people the Romans named but never ruled. They left no histories written in their own hand, no letters, no laws carved into stone. What remains are fragments, forts abandoned before they were finished, stones carved with symbols that explain nothing, names that appear briefly in other people's records and then fall silent. This video follows the Picts through what can still be observed. Roman reports, archaeological sites, landscapes that never stopped being used. There are no legends here, and no answers forced where the evidence ends, only what survives, placed carefully in time and place. The Picts did not vanish. Their name did. What happened in between is quieter, slower, and more grounded than later stories suggest. It is a history built from limits, not conclusions, and from absence itself alone. Quiet names on the northern frontier. In the surviving Roman records, the people later called the Picts begin as a problem at the edge of a map. They wrote about movement, raids, and rough country beyond their forts. The language stays practical. Places are mentioned because an army passed through them, or because a garrison could not hold them. When Rome first pushed into what is now Scotland, the names in use were not yet Pict. Tacitus, writing about the campaigns of his father-in-law Gnaeus Julius Agricola, used Caledonians for northern groups encountered during advances in the late 1st century. He placed a major confrontation at Mons Graupius, traditionally dated to AD 83 or 84, and presented it as a large battle at the far reach of Roman operations. The details are limited to what a Roman author thought mattered. The general's decisions, the shape of the terrain, and the difficulty of holding ground after a victory. The later Roman withdrawal from the far north receives less explanation. The practical limits of supply and control sit behind the sentences. A fixed line came to matter more than scattered victories. Under Emperor Hadrian, a wall was built across northern Britannia around AD 122, with forts, mile castles, and turrets placed at regular intervals along its length. It was a boundary that could be staffed, supplied, and watched. The wall also organised the surrounding land. Soldiers, traders, and local communities gathered where gates and roads made movement predictable. In that narrow space, Roman officials learned which kinds of threats were recurring and which were seasonal. The frontier shifted again under Antoninus Pius. Around AD 142, the Antonine Wall was built farther north across the central belt of Scotland. It was turf on stone foundations, supported by forts and linked by a military road. The wall did not last long, as the empire's northern line. Within a couple of decades, the garrisons withdrew, and the main frontier returned south to Hadrian's Wall. The brief occupation still left evidence in the form Rome preferred. Inscriptions, distant slabs, and the traces of temporary camps. Those remains show effort and uncertainty at the same time. The army could build quickly, yet it could not make the new line permanent. The word Pict enters the record later, and it appears as a label rather than an introduction. A panegyric by Eumenius in AD 297 refers to Picts in a context of imperial victories, using the name as if the audience already understood it. In AD 364, the historian Ammianus Marcellinus mentions coordinated troubles in Britain involving Picts, Scots, Saxons, and Atticotti, describing raids and pressure on Roman defences. The phrasing suggests a pattern more than a single event. The Picts in these passages are not described through customs or leaders. They are defined by motion across a frontier and by the strain placed on Roman administration. Roman writers use such names in flexible ways. A term could cover multiple groups, or it could be applied to whichever forces were active in a given year. The same region might be described with different tribal names depending on the author and the period. The silence in the sources is also part of the story. Rome recorded what its officials needed to manage: troop movements, fort repairs, imperial orders, and threats that could be counted. The people beyond the line are often present only as causes of disruption. Archaeology fills some gaps without resolving the core problem of identity. North of Hadrian's Wall and beyond the Antonine line, settlement remains show farming communities, small enclosed sites, and hill-fort traditions that long predate the Roman presence. Material culture does not draw sharp borders that match later political names. Objects travel, styles blend, and local practices shift over time. The Roman period adds another layer. Imported goods appear in some places, and Roman metalwork and glass reach far beyond direct occupation. Those items can arrive through trade, diplomacy, or capture. They do not require conquest. Imperial attention returned to the far north at the start of the 3rd century. Emperor Septimius Severus campaigned in Britain from AD 208 until his death at York in AD 211. Later summaries speak of harsh conditions, difficult marches, and heavy losses from terrain and disease. The campaign is often described as an attempt to reassert control beyond the usual frontier. Even with an emperor present, permanent occupation did not follow. After Severus, the empire did not build a lasting line farther north than Hadrian's Wall. The decision reflects priorities across a wide empire. Britain was one province among many, and a distant war in wet uplands competed with threats on other borders. As Roman power in Britain weakened during the 4th and early 5th centuries, the written record changes again. Administrative documents become rarer, and frontier life grows harder to reconstruct year by year. What remains points to repeated pressure along the northern zones and to shifting alliances among post-Roman kingdoms. In this later landscape, the term Pict continues as a Roman and then Latin label for peoples north and northeast of the old frontiers. It is still an outside name in most surviving texts. The internal names used by those communities are largely absent from the written sources that survived. The later visibility of the Picts owes much to stones rather than manuscripts. Symbol stones, carved slabs, and monumental markers appear across eastern and northern Scotland, often dated broadly to the early medieval period. Many carry combinations of geometric symbols, animals, and later Christian crosses. Some include scenes of hunting, combat, or mounted figures. The carvings are not direct translations of Roman accounts, and they do not follow Roman habits of inscription. They suggest local systems of display and memory, with messages meant for people who already understood the code. The stones are fixed in places where travel routes and territories could be marked, but their meanings remain cautious territory for scholarship. A symbol can be identified, yet its full purpose can remain uncertain. A later event illustrates how the Picts appear when other kingdoms begin writing about them. In AD 685, a battle known as Dun Nechtain was fought between the Picts, led by King Brede mac Beally, and the Northumbrians under King Ecgfrith. Bede, writing in the early 8th century, described Ecgfrith advancing into Pictish territory against advice and being killed with much of his army on 20 May. The account is brief and moral in Bede's framing, but the basic outline is concrete: a king, an incursion, rough ground, and a decisive defeat. For the Picts, the battle matters in the sources, mainly because it altered Northumbrian power in the north. The Picts become visible at the moment they resist a neighbour's dominance, not because outsiders suddenly learn their inner life. By the time Latin writers and later chroniclers use Pictland more routinely, Rome itself is no longer present to interpret the north. The name persists, but the context has shifted. Earlier Roman terms were shaped by imperial borders and military logistics. Later, medieval references are shaped by regional kingship, church networks, and rivalries across Britain and Ireland. The people behind the label did not stay still across those centuries. The term remained steady, while leadership, language, and political structures likely changed more than the word suggests. In the first layer of evidence, the Picts are not a full portrait. They are a recurring edge case in other people's records, attached to walls, raids, and difficult country. The quietness of the sources is not an accident. It reflects what survives and what was valued by the writers who left it behind, how Rome measured the north. The northern frontier of Roman Britain was never a single fixed idea. It was a process recorded in layers of construction, repair, and abandonment. What survives in the ground reflects choices made over decades, not a final plan. Each line drawn across the landscape was tested against weather, supply, and resistance, then adjusted or withdrawn. Hadrian's Wall remains the clearest example of this approach. Built beginning around AD 122, it stretched roughly 80 Roman miles from the River Tyne in the east to the Solway Firth in the west. The wall was not uniform. In some areas it was built of stone, in others of turf, depending on available materials and local conditions. Mile castles were placed at regular intervals, each capable of holding a small detachment. Turrets stood between them, creating a rhythm of observation points rather than a continuous barrier. Movement was controlled, not stopped. Gates allowed passage for trade, diplomacy, and patrols. The forts attached to the wall revealed daily life more clearly than the wall itself. Vindolanda, just south of the main line, provides one of the richest records. Thin wooden writing tablets found there preserve routine details. Supply requests, duty rosters, invitations to birthday celebrations, and notes about footwear. One tablet mentions a shortage of socks and underwear during cold weather. Another lists men absent without explanation. These texts do not mention the Picts directly. They show the concerns of soldiers maintaining order at a distance from Rome. North of Hadrian's Wall, Rome experimented again. The Antonine Wall was built beginning around AD 142 under Antoninus Pius. It ran approximately 40 miles between the Firth of Forth and the Firth of Clyde. Unlike Hadrian's Wall, it relied heavily on turf laid over a stone base. Large forts such as Rough Castle, Bar Hill, and Bearsden anchored the line. Distant slabs carved with inscriptions recorded the lengths built by individual legions, often accompanied by relief carvings showing Roman victories or captives. The slabs name units, not enemies. The message is administrative and commemorative, aimed inward at the empire. The Antonine Wall's short lifespan is evident in the archaeological record. Repairs are fewer, and occupation layers are thinner. Coins, pottery, and refuse suggest active use for perhaps 20 years before withdrawal. The reasons are not spelled out in surviving texts. The ground itself offers clues. The central belt is exposed, with fewer natural obstacles than the hill country farther north. Supplying the line required longer routes, and holding it demanded constant manpower. When pressures elsewhere in the empire increased, the cost of maintaining this forward position likely outweighed its benefits. Beyond the walls, Rome relied on roads and temporary camps. Marching camps appear across eastern Scotland, identifiable by their distinctive playing card shape. Sites such as Kaya House, Wython Wells, and Durno show repeated use, sometimes overlapping, suggesting multiple campaigns over time. These camps were not towns. They left little trace beyond ditches and ramparts, yet their distribution maps movement through Pictish territory rather than settlement within it. The army passed through, recorded its presence, and left. Roman maps do not survive in original form for Britain, but later compilations hint at how space was understood. The Antonine itinerary lists routes and distances between points, focusing on roads and stopping places. Names appear and disappear depending on relevance. Areas beyond stable control are compressed or vague. Measurement mattered, where Rome could move regularly, where it could not. Detail thinned. Frontier management also relied on diplomacy and local arrangements. Roman goods found north of the walls include coins, brooches, and metal vessels. Some may have been payment to allied groups or gifts to local leaders. Others could have arrived through trade networks extending across the North Sea and Irish Sea. The presence of Roman items does not indicate Roman authority. It shows contact within a wider system of exchange. Local communities selected what they used and how they used it. By the late 3rd and 4th centuries, the northern frontier took on a different character. Large-scale building slowed. Existing forts remained in use, but garrisons were reduced or reorganized. Ammianus Marcellinus describes coordinated attacks during the barbarian conspiracy of AD 367, when Picts, along with other groups, crossed boundaries while Roman forces were distracted. The response involved restoring order rather than expanding territory. The walls functioned as rallying points, not launch pads. Inscriptions from this period emphasize repair rather than conquest. Stones record the rebuilding of gates, walls, and headquarters buildings under specific governors or emperors. The language is formal and restrained. There is no claim of permanent resolution. As Roman authority waned in Britain during the early 5th century, the walls did not vanish. They remained as physical features in the landscape, reused and reinterpreted. Stones were taken for later buildings. Forts became centres for local power or settlement. The lines that once measured imperial reach became references for post-Roman boundaries and memory. What the frontier shows is not failure or success, but method. Rome did not attempt to erase the societies north of its walls. It measured them, monitored them, and adjusted its position accordingly. The Picts appear in this system as recurring pressure beyond manageable lines. They are present where Rome recorded limits, not where Rome claimed mastery. The walls and camps do not explain who the Picts were in full. They show how Rome defined its own edge. Turf, stone, roads, and tablets form a record of distance rather than understanding. The silence about internal Pictish life remains consistent across these materials. The stones left by the Picts. Across northern and eastern Scotland, stones stand where writing is absent. They do not explain themselves. They do not identify their makers by name. Their presence is measured by location, form, and repetition rather than text. These stones form the most direct material record left by the people later called the Picts. The earliest group is often referred to as Class 1 stones. These are unshaped or roughly shaped stones, bearing symbols carved into their surfaces. They are found from Fife and Perthshire, north into Moray, and Easter Ross. The carvings are usually shallow but deliberate. Common symbols include a crescent with a V-shaped rod, a double disc joined by a bar, a mirror and comb, and various animals rendered in outline. The stones are rarely decorated on more than one face. They were not designed to be walked around. They were meant to be seen from a particular direction. Dating these stones relies on context rather than inscription. They are generally placed between the 3rd and 7th centuries based on associated settlements, burial evidence, and later reuse. Some are found near older prehistoric sites, including standing stones and burial grounds that long predate the Picts. Others appear near river crossings, coastal routes, or natural boundaries. The placement suggests familiarity with land movement rather than centralized planning. The symbols themselves resist full interpretation. They repeat across wide distances with consistent form, implying shared meaning. The mirror and comb appear frequently, sometimes alone, sometimes paired with other symbols. Animal figures include fish, birds, wolves, and a distinctive creature, often called the Pictish beast, with a curved snout and spiral hip. The lack of variation argues against purely decorative use. At the same time, no bilingual inscription or explanatory text survives to anchor their meaning. Later stones, known as Class 2, show a clear change. These stones are shaped slabs, often bearing Christian crosses on one face and Pictish symbols on the other. They date mainly from the 7th to 9th centuries, a period when Christianity had become established among Pictish elites. The crosses are carved in relief and often filled with interlace patterns. Scenes of hunting, battle, and procession appear alongside biblical imagery. The presence of Christian imagery provides firmer chronological anchors. These stones can be linked to monastic centres such as Port Mahomac, St Vigians, and Magel. At Port Mahomac on the Tarbat Peninsula, excavations revealed a monastery active from the late 6th century, producing carved stone fragments, metalwork, and evidence of literacy. The carved stones found nearby share stylistic elements with the site's artefacts. This suggests local production rather than import. Despite Christian influence, the symbol system persists without translation. Crosses carry recognizable forms drawn from wider insular art traditions. The symbols remain specific and unchanged. Their continued use indicates that they retained relevance within Pictish society even as religious practices shifted. They were not replaced by Latin inscriptions in the way Roman monuments had been. A smaller number of Class 3 stones show crosses without symbols. These are generally later and resemble early medieval sculpture found elsewhere in Britain and Ireland. By this point, the distinctive Pictish symbol system fades from use. The reasons are not recorded. Political change, including the emergence of the Kingdom of Alba in the 9th century, altered the cultural landscape. Stone carving continued, but the earlier visual language was no longer employed. Some stones are associated with burials. Others stand alone, with no clear connection to graves. Excavations at Rhynie in Aberdeenshire uncovered a high-status settlement near a cluster of symbol stones, including one depicting a large figure holding a staff or weapon. The site contained evidence of feasting, metalworking, and imported goods from as far as the Mediterranean. The stones in this context appear tied to elite display rather than funerary practice alone. Weathering has erased details on many stones, complicating analysis. In some cases, only partial symbols remain visible. Early antiquarians recorded stones that have since been lost or destroyed. Their drawings vary in accuracy, but they provide some record of vanished material. Stones were built into later walls, churches, and farm buildings, sometimes with carvings turned inward. The absence of written explanation does not imply randomness. The consistency of symbol pairs across regions suggests rules governing their combination. Certain symbols appear together repeatedly, while others do not. This patterning implies a structured system, possibly linked to identity, lineage, or territorial claims. Scholars have proposed many interpretations, but the stones themselves do not confirm any single explanation. What can be stated with confidence is limited. Stones were carved by skilled hands using iron tools. They were placed deliberately in visible locations. Their symbols were understood by contemporary viewers. They functioned within a shared cultural framework that did not rely on alphabetic writing for public display. This sets them apart from Roman practices and aligns them more closely with other non-literate monumental traditions. The stones do not narrate events. They do not name rulers or dates. They mark presence rather than history. Their silence forces reliance on pattern, distribution, and context. Through these, a picture emerges of a society that communicated identity and authority visually, grounded in land and repetition rather than text. The Pictish stones stand as fixed points in a changing world. Roman frontiers shifted and dissolved. Kingdoms rose and merged. The stones remained, even as their meanings faded from use. They offer evidence without explanation, requiring careful description rather than interpretation. Power and rule in Pictland. Knowledge of Pictish kingship comes from fragments preserved outside Pictland itself. No contemporary royal annals written by the Picts survive. What exists instead are later king lists, brief notices in Irish chronicles, and occasional references in Northumbrian and Frankish sources. These materials were written for other purposes, often long after the events they describe. One of the earliest structured sources is the Pictish king list, preserved in several medieval manuscripts, including the Pictland manuscript compiled in the 14th century. The list arranges rulers in sequence, sometimes assigning lengths of reign. The earliest names, such as Cruithne and his sons, belong to origin traditions rather than verifiable history. Later sections include names that appear in external records, allowing partial alignment with datable events. Even here, inconsistencies between versions suggest copying, omission, and regional bias. Irish annals provide firmer chronological anchors. The Annals of Ulster and the Annals of Tigernach mention Pictish kings mainly at moments of death or conflict. Entries are short. A typical notice might record that a king was killed in battle or died of illness, followed by the year. For example, Brede, son of Beli, who ruled in the later 7th century, appears in several entries tied to military encounters with Northumbria. The annals do not describe administrative acts, legal decisions, or court life. Archaeological evidence adds another layer. Certain sites show signs of elite occupation consistent with royal centres. Forteviot in Perthshire, later associated with the kings of Alba, contains early medieval features that may reflect earlier Pictish use. Rhynie in Aberdeenshire, excavated in the 21st century, revealed a fortified settlement with high-status artefacts, including imported Mediterranean pottery and evidence of metalworking. A symbol stone depicting a large human figure stands nearby. The scale and material richness of the site suggests centralized authority, even if the specific ruler remains unnamed. Other places recur in the sources as royal strongholds or meeting points. Burghead on the Moray Firth, with its massive promontory fort, was occupied and modified over centuries. Carved bull symbols found there hint at ritual or symbolic importance tied to power. Dundurn in Strathion and Craig Phaedrig near Inverness also show signs of fortification and control of surrounding land. These sites are not evenly distributed. They cluster in regions suited to agriculture, movement, and communication. Succession among Pictish kings appears complex. Later writers noted that kingship did not always pass from father to son. Bede, writing in the early 8th century, stated that when questions arose, the Picts sometimes chose kings from the female royal line. His remark is brief and not elaborated. Modern interpretations have ranged from matrilineal succession to flexible selection among eligible kin. Brothers, cousins, and sons all appear in king lists. The absence of explanatory text limits certainty. The names of kings themselves provide limited clues. Many are recorded in Old Irish or Latinized forms, reflecting the languages of the scribes rather than the spoken Pictish tongue. Names such as Nectan, Talocan, and Drest recur across generations. Repetition may reflect dynastic naming practices or the consolidation of certain name forms in later memory. It does not necessarily indicate stable, long-lived institutions in the Roman sense. Christianity altered the visibility of kingship without fully clarifying it. From the 7th century onward, Pictish kings appear in ecclesiastical contexts. Kings granted land to monasteries, attended church councils, or were admonished by clerics. King Nectan, son of Dairelay, ruling in the early 8th century, is known for correspondence with Northumbrian church leaders regarding the calculation of Easter and clerical tonsure. These letters survive through Bede's history, not Pictish archives. They show a ruler engaged with religious authority beyond his borders, negotiating conformity rather than isolation. The church provided new forms of record, but it did not replace older systems entirely. Monastic sites such as Port Mahomac and St Andrews became centres of learning and production, yet royal actions are still sparsely documented. Inscriptions remain rare. Authority continued to be expressed through land control, tribute, and display rather than written decree. Kings ruled through presence and alliance, reinforced by symbols and sites familiar to their followers. Conflict shaped the record unevenly. When Pictish kings fought Northumbrian or Dalriadan rulers, their names entered foreign chronicles. When they managed internal affairs, silence followed. The defeat of King Egfrith of Northumbria by Bredy mac Beally in AD 685 brought Pictish leadership briefly into sharp focus. Afterward, Brede appears as a dominant figure in northern Britain for 2 decades. Even then, his domestic governance is not described. Power is inferred from outcomes rather than process. By the 9th century, references to Pictish kings diminish as political structures change. Figures such as Synaid mac Aelpin, later remembered as Kenneth MacAlpin, appear at the transition between Pictish and Gaelic dominance. Later traditions describe conquest or merger, but contemporary records are minimal. What is visible is a shift in naming, language, and external alignment. Kingship continues, but the label Pict gradually recedes from written use. Throughout the period, Pictish kingship remains identifiable, but not transparent. Names, deaths, and a handful of actions form the outline. Archaeological sites suggest centres of power, yet they do not reveal administrative detail. Later chroniclers shaped memory according to their own concerns, often projecting order backward onto a past that left little explanation of itself. The result is a picture of rule without commentary. Kings existed, commanded loyalty, and engaged with neighbours. Their authority rested on land, lineage, and recognition rather than documents. What survives is enough to confirm continuity, but not enough to describe governance in full, a language that left no sentences. The language spoken by the Picts is known only through traces. No complete sentence written in that language survives. There are no manuscripts, letters, or inscriptions that record it directly. What remains are names attached to people and places, preserved by writers who used other languages to record them. From these fragments, the existence of a distinct spoken language is clear, even if its structure remains largely inaccessible. Roman and later medieval writers did not record Pictish speech phonetically. They rendered names into Latin or Old Irish forms, adapting unfamiliar sounds to familiar spelling systems. This process altered pronunciation and sometimes meaning. The result is a filtered record, shaped by the ears and conventions of outsiders. Even so, patterns emerge when names are examined in large numbers. Personal names provide one set of clues. Names of Pictish kings, such as Brede, Nectan, Talocan, and Drest, appear repeatedly in Irish annals and king lists. Linguistic comparisons suggest that many of these names derive from Brittonic roots, related to the languages spoken in Roman Britain and later Wales. For example, the name Bride is often linked to a form related to high or exalted, though the exact meaning is uncertain. The consistency of such names across centuries suggests continuity rather than borrowing from neighbours. Place names offer broader geographic evidence. Across eastern and northern Scotland, river names such as Dee, Don, Spey and Tay are considered ancient, predating both Gaelic and Old Norse settlement. These hydronyms resist clear translation, but align with naming patterns found in Brittonic-speaking regions farther south. Settlement names, beginning with elements like Alba, meaning river mouth, appear in locations such as Aberdeen and Abernethy. The distribution of these names corresponds closely with areas identified as Pictish in historical sources. Other place name elements complicate the picture. Later, Gaelic layers introduced terms such as bal, meaning farm or settlement, which often overlay earlier names. Norse influence along the northern and western coasts added another layer, especially from the 9th century onward. As a result, many Pictish names survive only in altered form, embedded within later linguistic structures. Identifying the original layer requires careful separation of these influences. Bede, writing in the early 8th century, provides one of the few explicit statements about language in Pictland. He noted that Britain contained several languages, including those of the Britons, Picts, Scots, and English, all united by Latin for church use. His remark confirms that Pictish was considered distinct from both Brittonic and Gaelic by contemporary observers. He did not describe its sound or grammar. The statement functions as a classification rather than an explanation. The absence of writing in Pictish does not indicate a lack of communication or complexity. Oral cultures often maintain detailed systems of law, genealogy, and memory without written records. In Pictland, authority and identity appear to have been communicated visually through symbols, stones, and place. Speech would have operated within that framework, supported by shared understanding rather than permanent text. Attempts to reconstruct Pictish grammar or vocabulary remain limited. Some scholars have proposed that Pictish was a northern branch of Brittonic, closely related to early Welsh and Cumbric. Others have argued for a more divergent language, influenced by earlier substrata no longer identifiable. The evidence available does not allow resolution. What can be stated is that Pictish shared features with Brittonic languages, while retaining distinct elements. Ogham inscriptions add another fragmentary source. A small number of stones in eastern Scotland bear Ogham script, a writing system primarily associated with early Irish. The inscriptions are brief and often damaged. Some appear to record personal names that are not clearly Gaelic. These inscriptions suggest contact with Irish literate culture and an interest in marking names, but they do not amount to extended writing in Pictish. The script was borrowed without generating a native written tradition. The transition to Gaelic dominance altered the linguistic landscape significantly. By the 9th and 10th centuries, Gaelic had become the language of kingship and record in much of former Pictland. Royal genealogies, legal traditions, and ecclesiastical texts were composed in Gaelic or Latin. Pictish speech likely declined over generations, absorbed into the new dominant language. The process is not documented directly. It is inferred from the disappearance of Pictish naming patterns and the spread of Gaelic ones. Some Pictish elements may survive within modern Scottish place names and dialects, but isolating them with certainty is difficult. Language change tends to smooth over older forms rather than preserve them intact. Sounds shift, meanings narrow or broaden, and spellings adjust to new norms. What remains identifiable is often only what resisted replacement, such as river names and major geographic features. The lack of written sentences shapes how the language can be discussed. There are no quotations to analyze, no syntax to diagram. The language is encountered indirectly, through how others wrote about it and through the names that endured long enough to be recorded. This limits interpretation to cautious description rather than reconstruction. Pictish speech existed within a multilingual environment. Latin functioned as the language of administration and church. Old Irish spread through religious networks and dynastic ties. Brittonic languages persisted in the south. Pictish speakers would have encountered multiple tongues in trade, diplomacy, and conflict. Multilingualism was likely common among elites, further reducing the need for a written vernacular tradition. What remains is absence shaped by survival. The Picts did not leave sentences behind, but they left names fixed to land and lineage. Those names confirm that a language was spoken, shared, and understood across generations. Its sounds are lost, but its footprint remains in geography and memory. The study of Pictish language rests on restraint. Each fragment supports limited claims and resists expansion. The evidence allows recognition without recovery. The language can be located in time and space, but not heard. Everyday lives in the shadow of forts and stones. Most people living in Pictland never appear in written records. Their lives are reconstructed through soil marks, post holes, animal bones, and fragments of tools. These remains point to routines shaped by land, season, and local networks rather than by distant political events. Daily life was steady, repetitive, and closely tied to place. Settlement evidence shows a preference for small communities rather than large towns. Roundhouses dominate the archaeological record from the Iron Age into the early medieval period. These structures were built with timber posts, wattle walls, and thatched roofs. Many were rebuilt on the same spot over generations, creating layered remains beneath the surface. The repeated use of sites indicates continuity rather than frequent relocation. In lowland areas, clusters of roundhouses formed unenclosed farmsteads. In upland or exposed regions, settlements were often protected by earthworks or stone walls. Some sites developed into hill forts or enclosed strongholds, though these were not uniformly defensive. Excavations suggest that some enclosures served as status markers or seasonal gathering points rather than permanent refuges. Agriculture formed the basis of subsistence. Charred grain remains recovered from sites across eastern Scotland show the cultivation of barley, oats, and wheat. Barley appears most frequently, likely because it tolerated poor soils and shorter growing seasons. Fields were small and irregular, shaped by local terrain rather than surveyed grids. Tools such as sickles and quernstones indicate on-site processing rather than centralized production. Animal husbandry was equally important. Cattle bones dominate many assemblages, followed by sheep and pigs. Cattle provided meat, milk, hides, and traction. Sheep offered wool and meat, while pigs were efficient sources of protein where means allowed. Seasonal slaughter patterns suggest planning and storage rather than constant consumption. Fish bones and shellfish remains show that rivers and coasts supplemented inland diets. Food preparation took place within domestic spaces. Hearths are common features in excavated houses, often centrally placed. Pottery fragments indicate cooking over open fire rather than baking. Vessels were typically handmade, with simple forms and limited decoration. Their durability mattered more than appearance. Broken pottery was discarded nearby, contributing to midden layers that now provide dietary evidence. Metalwork appears regularly but unevenly. Iron tools such as knives, awls, and agricultural implements are common finds, reflecting practical needs. Bronze and silver objects are rarer and usually associated with high-status contexts. Items such as brooches, pins, and arm rings suggest personal adornment, though their distribution implies that display was limited to certain segments of society. Most people wore functional clothing suited to work and climate. Textile production left subtle traces. Loom weights, spindle whorls, and bone pins appear at settlement sites, indicating the spinning and weaving of wool and possibly flax. Textile work was time-consuming and often carried out alongside other tasks. Finished products do not survive, but their tools point to household-level production rather than specialized workshops. Craft activity extended beyond textiles. Evidence of woodworking appears in tool marks and preserved timbers from waterlogged sites. Bone and antler were shaped into combs, pins, and handles. Stone was used for tools, querns, and building material. Production was local and responsive to need. There is little sign of mass production aimed at distant markets. Trade existed but did not dominate daily life. Imported items such as Roman glass, pottery, and later Mediterranean ceramics appear mainly at elite sites. Their rarity in ordinary settlements suggests limited access. When such items appear outside high-status contexts, they may represent second-hand circulation or reuse. Exchange networks connected communities, but most goods were produced and consumed locally. Roman influence on daily life north of the walls was indirect. Some communities adopted Roman-style objects or practices, while others did not. There is no uniform pattern of Romanization. Instead, selective adoption appears based on utility and prestige. A Roman vessel could be used without adopting Roman customs. The presence of such items reflects contact rather than control. Burial practices add another dimension. Early Pictish burials are varied, including cist graves, cairns, and flat graves. Grave goods are limited, often consisting of personal items rather than wealth displays. Later, Christian burials shift toward east-west alignment and placement near churches. These changes reflect evolving beliefs, but do not erase older practices immediately. Overlapping traditions persisted for generations. Children are visible in the record mainly through burial evidence and small artifacts. Toy-like objects are rare, though miniatures may have served instructional or symbolic purposes. Growth patterns observed in skeletal remains indicate hard physical labor from a young age. Childhood was integrated into household work rather than separated from it. Health and injury are documented through skeletal analysis. Signs of joint wear, healed fractures, and dental disease appear regularly. These indicate physically demanding lives and limited medical intervention. At the same time, healed injuries show that individuals often survived trauma and continued working. Community care likely played a role in recovery, even if it left no material trace. The rhythm of life followed natural cycles. Planting, harvesting, animal care, and maintenance structured the year. Winter required preparation and storage. Summer demanded extended labor. The environment set boundaries that technology could only partially overcome. Stability depended on cooperation within households and between neighboring settlements. Religious practice intersected with daily life without dominating it. Before Christianity, ritual activity may have centered on natural features, carved stones, or communal gatherings. After conversion, churches and monasteries introduced new focal points. Attendance and observance varied by region and status. For many, belief coexisted with routine rather than interrupting it. What emerges from the evidence is not a dramatic portrait but a steady one. Most Picts lived close to the land, repeating tasks learned from previous generations. Their lives were shaped by practical concerns more than political shifts. Kings rose and fell, frontiers moved, and names changed. But daily work continued with limited alteration. The ordinary lives of the Picts are visible only through accumulation. Each posthole, bone fragment, and tool mark adds a small piece. Together they show a society grounded in labour, local knowledge, and continuity. These lives form the background against which monuments and kingship took shape, even if they were never recorded in words. Faith arrives quietly across the north. Christianity reached Pictland without a single moment of arrival. There is no surviving account that records a mass conversion or a decisive royal decree. Instead, the evidence points to gradual presence, uneven adoption, and long periods of coexistence with earlier beliefs. The traces of this process appear in stones, place names, and a small number of written references created outside Pictland. The earliest Christian influence likely came through contact rather than mission. Roman Britain to the south had established Christian communities by the 4th century. Trade, diplomacy, and movement across frontiers carried ideas as well as goods. Individuals travelling north, whether clerics, traders, or captives, would have brought Christian practices into regions beyond Roman control. These early contacts left little direct evidence, but they set conditions for later development. More visible signs emerge in the 6th century. By this time, Christian monasteries were established in parts of Ireland and western Scotland. The monastery at Iona, founded by Columba around AD 563, is often associated with the Christianization of northern Britain. Columba's life, written by a Domnan in the late 7th century, includes episodes involving Pictish rulers. The text describes meetings with King Brudet, son of Maelshon, at a fortress near Inverness. The narrative emphasizes persuasion and respect rather than coercion. It does not describe widespread conversion, only royal engagement. Archaeological evidence aligns with a slow process. Early Christian sites in Pictland are modest in scale. Monasteries such as Portmahomac, St Andrews, and Whithorn show phased development rather than sudden foundation. At Portmahomac, excavation revealed an enclosed settlement with workshops, cemeteries, and carved stone fragments. Radiocarbon dating places its main activity between the late 6th and early 8th centuries. The site produced evidence of vellum preparation and metalworking, suggesting a literate religious community integrated with craft production. Church buildings were initially simple. Timber structures likely preceded stone churches, leaving minimal trace. Later stone churches reused earlier sacred spaces or prominent locations. Their orientation and layout followed wider Christian norms, but local variation remained. Burial grounds associated with churches showed changes in practice, such as east-west alignment and reduced grave goods. These changes appear gradually, overlapping with older burial traditions. Carved stones provide some of the clearest material evidence of Christian presence. Class II stones combine crosses with traditional Pictish symbols. The crosses vary in design, often filled with interlace and geometric patterns similar to those found in insular art across Britain and Ireland. Biblical scenes appear occasionally, though they are not always clearly identifiable. The continued use of Pictish symbols alongside crosses indicates adaptation rather than replacement. Christianity was incorporated into existing visual systems. Written references to Pictish Christianity remain sparse. Bede, writing in the early 8th century, notes that the Picts adopted the correct calculation of Easter after consultation with Northumbrian authorities. He names King Nectan, son of Derilais, as a supporter of ecclesiastical reform. Bede's account focuses on conformity within church practice, not on popular belief. His interest lies in orthodoxy rather than daily devotion. Monasteries served multiple roles. They were centres of worship, learning, and production. Donations of land or privilege to religious houses appear in later traditions, though contemporary charters do not survive. These relationships tied Christian institutions to elite power while leaving everyday religious practice largely undocumented. Christian symbols entered domestic life unevenly. Small crosses, carved stones, and personal items appear in some contexts but not others. The distribution suggests selective adoption based on proximity to religious centres and social status. There is no evidence that Christianity immediately transformed household routines. Agricultural cycles, food preparation, and craft production continued without visible disruption. Earlier beliefs did not disappear with the arrival of Christianity. Sacred landscapes persisted. Springs, hills, and ancient stones retained significance, sometimes reinterpreted within a Christian framework. Churches were built near or on earlier ritual sites, integrating them into new religious geography. This reuse reduced conflict by preserving familiar places while altering their meaning. Clerics in Pictland likely spoke multiple languages. Latin functioned as the language of liturgy and learning. Old Irish influenced ecclesiastical practice through monastic networks. Pictish speech remained the language of daily life. Multilingualism allowed religious ideas to circulate without requiring a written vernacular tradition. Sermons, instruction, and ritual could adapt to local speech without leaving text behind. Christian cemeteries provide insight into belief and community. Graves associated with churches show a focus on collective burial rather than individual display. Grave markers are rare in early phases. Over time, carved slabs and cross-marked stones appear, sometimes bearing personal names in Latin or Ogham. These inscriptions remain brief, emphasizing identity rather than narrative. The spread of Christianity also altered timekeeping. Christian festivals introduced a liturgical calendar that existed alongside seasonal rhythms. Easter, Christmas, and Saints' Days structured communal gatherings. These observances did not replace agricultural timing, but added another layer to social organization. The calendar linked Pictland to wider Christian networks without erasing local patterns. Conflict occasionally intersected with religion. Differences in church practice, such as the calculation of Easter, became matters of royal concern. These disputes were resolved through correspondence and councils rather than force. The resolution of such issues reflects the integration of Pictish elites into broader ecclesiastical structures. By the 8th century, Christianity was established among Pictish rulers and religious communities. Its presence among the wider population is inferred rather than documented. The lack of resistance narrative suggests accommodation rather than opposition. Faith entered through contact, example, and gradual institutional growth. What remains visible is change without rupture. Crosses appear alongside older symbols. Churches rise near long-used places. Burials adjust orientation and form over generations. The evidence supports continuity shaped by adaptation. It settled into existing landscapes and routines, leaving marks that can be traced without explaining every belief behind them. Neighbours, rivals, and pressure from the south. Pictland did not exist in isolation. Its boundaries were shaped by contact with neighbouring peoples whose names appear more frequently in surviving records. These interactions were not constant warfare, nor were they stable alliances. They shifted according to leadership, geography, and external pressure. The evidence that remains records moments of contact rather than continuous relations. To the south, the most persistent presence was Northumbria. Emerging in the 7th century from earlier Anglian settlements, the Northumbrian kingdom expanded northward along the eastern coast of Britain. Its rulers left written records through church histories and annals, which now form a major source for understanding contact with the Picts. These texts focus on campaigns, tribute, and the rise and fall of kings, reflecting Northumbrian concerns rather than Pictish priorities. Early encounters appear sporadically. In the early 7th century, Northumbrian kings such as Ethelfrith and Edwin exerted influence over neighbouring Brittonic kingdoms and extended pressure toward Pictish territories. The extent of this influence is uncertain. Some references suggest temporary dominance or tribute rather than occupation. Control was measured in recognition rather than administration. When leadership changed, influence often receded. The Battle of Dunechtain in AD 685 marks a clear moment of shift. Northumbrian King Egfrith advanced into Pictish territory and was killed along with much of his force. Bede recorded the event with brevity, noting the location as difficult terrain and the outcome as decisive. After this defeat, Northumbrian expansion north of the Firth of Forth ceased. Pictish power became more visible in external sources, not through description of governance, but through the absence of further Northumbrian advances. To the west, relations with the Kingdom of Dalriata followed a different pattern. Dalriata, with territories in western Scotland and northeastern Ireland, shared linguistic and cultural ties across the sea. Interaction with the Picts included conflict, alliance, and periods of overlordship. Irish annals record battles between Pictish and Dalriadan forces across the 7th and 8th centuries. Victories are noted without detail. Losses are counted without explanation. Kingship ties link the two regions. Brede mac Billy, known for his role in defeating Northumbria, is also recorded as exerting authority over Dalriata. Annal entries from the late 7th century suggest Dalriadan subordination during parts of his reign. This dominance appears temporary. Later entries record reversals and renewed independence. Control fluctuated, reflecting personal power rather than permanent political integration. Brittonic kingdoms to the south and southwest also formed part of the Pictish environment. Regions such as Strathclyde maintained their own rulers and identities. Contact between Picts and Britons is less frequently recorded, though place name evidence suggests shared linguistic heritage. Conflict is mentioned occasionally, but the absence of sustained narrative implies limited direct confrontation compared to Northumbria or Dalriata. The sea formed another axis of contact. Coastal Pictish communities faced the North Sea, connecting them to wider trade and movement networks. From the late 8th century onward, Norse activity altered these patterns. Early Viking raids are recorded in Irish annals and later chronicles. Monasteries such as Portmahomac show evidence of destruction around the early 9th century. The cause is debated, but Norse involvement remains a plausible explanation given regional patterns. Norse settlement affected northern and western regions more than the eastern heartlands. The impact on Pictish political structures appears uneven. Some areas experienced disruption and depopulation. Others adapted through trade or accommodation. Norse place names later overlay earlier ones, especially along coasts and islands. This linguistic shift reflects long-term settlement rather than brief raiding. Pressure from multiple directions shaped Pictish responses. There is no evidence of a centralized standing army. Defense likely relied on regional leaders mobilizing local forces when needed. Hill forts and enclosed sites provided temporary refuge rather than permanent garrisons. Movement through familiar terrain offered advantages against larger invading forces unfamiliar with the landscape. Diplomacy accompanied conflict. Marriage alliances linked ruling families across regions. These ties appear indirectly through genealogies preserved in later sources. Such alliances could stabilize borders temporarily or draw Pictish rulers into wider disputes. The lack of detailed records limits understanding of these arrangements, but their existence is implied by recurring dynastic connections. Religion also influenced relations. Shared Christian practice provided common ground between Pictish and Northumbrian elites, even during political rivalry. Ecclesiastical correspondence and church reform efforts crossed political boundaries. These exchanges did not eliminate conflict, but they offered frameworks for negotiation and shared authority beyond warfare. Economic interaction persisted alongside rivalry. Trade goods moved across borders regardless of political tension. Agricultural products, livestock, and crafted items circulated through markets and seasonal gatherings. Control over trade routes and resource-rich areas likely contributed to conflict, though this motive is rarely stated explicitly in sources. By the early 9th century, the political landscape shifted again. Pictish kings faced pressure from Norse incursions and internal changes. At the same time, Gaelic influence from Dal Riata increased. Later traditions describe a merging of Pictish and Gaelic rule under figures such as Synaid Mac Ailpeen. Contemporary records do not describe the process. They simply reflect changing names and alignments. Throughout these interactions, the Picts appear consistently as a regional power rather than a marginal group. They resisted sustained control from the south and west, adapting to new pressures without disappearing immediately. This uneven attention shapes modern understanding. The pattern that emerges is one of constant adjustment. Borders shifted without formal treaties. Authority expanded and contracted with individual rulers. Conflict occurred without long campaigns of occupation. The Picts navigated a landscape defined by proximity rather than isolation. What survives in the sources reflects external perspectives. Battles, defeats, and royal deaths dominate the record. Peaceful coexistence and routine exchange remain largely invisible. The absence of narrative does not imply absence of contact. It reflects what chroniclers chose to record. Pictish relations with neighbours were defined by circumstance. Pressure from the south was real but inconsistent. Rivalry existed alongside cooperation. The balance changed over time, without producing a single defining outcome. The evidence supports continuity shaped by interaction rather than collapse through conquest. From Pictland to Alba, a quiet political shift. In the surviving records, the disappearance of Pictland does not read like an ending. There is no final battle described in contemporary detail, no formal declaration of conquest, and no abrupt change in settlement patterns. Instead, the term Pict gradually falls out of use while new political names appear. The land remains populated. Power continues to be exercised. Only the language used to describe rule changes. By the early 9th century, Pictish kings are still named in Irish annals. Figures such as Constantine, son of Fergus, and Oengus, son of Fergus, appear with recorded deaths and reigns. These entries follow the same restrained format used for earlier rulers. They do not suggest instability or collapse. Kings continue to rule, fight, and die in the same way they had for generations. At the same time, external pressures increased. Norse activity intensified along the coasts and river systems of northern Britain. Raids on monasteries and settlements disrupted existing power centres. Some regions experienced population movement or decline. Others adapted through defence or accommodation. The impact was uneven, but it affected both Pictish and Gaelic-speaking areas. The kingdom of Dal Riata, already closely linked to Pictland through alliance and rivalry, also faced Norse pressure. Its western coastal position made it vulnerable to repeated raids. By the early 9th century, references to Dalriadan kings diminish. This imbalance sets the stage for later consolidation rather than immediate replacement. The name Alba begins to appear in sources during the later 9th century. Initially, it does not describe a radically new state. It refers to the same general region previously called Pictland. The shift lies in terminology rather than territory. Kings who would once have been labelled Pictish are now associated with Alba, and their names increasingly follow Gaelic forms. Synaid mac Ailpin, later remembered as Kenneth MacAlpin, occupies a central place in later tradition. Contemporary evidence does not support such a narrative. Irish annals record Synaid's death in AD 858 and identify him as king of the Picts. They do not describe a massacre or forced replacement. His identity appears transitional rather than revolutionary. The political shift seems to have involved continuity of elite families rather than their removal. Several royal names recur across the transition period, adapted into Gaelic forms. The sons and grandsons of earlier rulers continue to appear in king lists. This suggests assimilation rather than displacement. Authority passed through existing networks, adjusted to new linguistic and cultural norms. Language plays a central role in the change. By the 9th century, Gaelic had become the dominant language of record, church, and kingship across much of northern Britain. This shift did not require the immediate disappearance of Pictish speech at the local level. It reflects the preferences of elites and institutions that produced written material. As records moved into Gaelic and Latin frameworks, Pictish identity became less visible. Ecclesiastical structures reinforced this process. Monastic centres increasingly aligned with Gaelic-speaking networks. Saints' cults, liturgical practice, and ecclesiastical administration followed patterns established in Ireland and Western Scotland. Bishops and abbots recorded events using the language and terminology of those traditions. As a result, political authority was described through Gaelic concepts of kingship. Place names offer parallel evidence. In regions formerly identified as Pictish, Gaelic place name elements spread steadily from the 9th century onward. Earlier Pictish or Brittonic elements were not erased entirely, but they were often modified or combined with Gaelic terms. This layering reflects gradual linguistic dominance, rather than population replacement. Administrative practice also changed. Earlier, Pictish kingship appears to have relied on regional centres and itinerant rule. Under the emerging kingdom of Alba, royal authority became more centralised, though still limited by geography. Sites such as Scone gained prominence as places of assembly and inauguration. These locations may have had earlier significance, but their role became more formalised in the new political order. The concept of kingship itself evolved subtly. Gaelic traditions emphasised dynastic continuity, genealogical legitimacy, and sacral kingship. These ideas were not entirely foreign to Pictish practice, but they were expressed differently. As Gaelic frameworks took hold, older modes of symbolic expression, such as Pictish carved symbols, ceased to be produced. Stone carving continued, but in forms aligned with wider insular Christian art. The disappearance of Pictish symbols from new monuments is one of the clearest material indicators of change. By the late 9th century, new stones no longer display the distinctive symbol pairs that defined earlier Pictish identity. Cross slabs and sculpture persist, but their visual language aligns with broader Gaelic and Christian norms. The older system was no longer needed to communicate authority. Written sources reflect this transition without commentary. Later annals refer to kings of Alba without explaining how the change occurred. Earlier labels simply stop appearing. This silence suggests that the shift was not perceived as abrupt by contemporary observers. It was understood as a continuation under a different name. The people living in former Pictland did not vanish. Their settlements, farming practices, and local traditions show continuity across the 9th and 10th centuries. Archaeological evidence does not indicate widespread abandonment or resettlement. Material culture changes slowly, reflecting adaptation rather than disruption. Identity at the local level likely remained complex. Individuals may have spoken different languages depending on context. Loyalty may have been directed toward local rulers rather than abstract kingdoms. The label applied by chroniclers did not necessarily reflect how people understood themselves. As political centres shifted, names followed authority rather than ethnicity. By the 10th century, the term Pict had largely disappeared from written use. Alba had become the dominant political designation for the region. Later medieval writers, looking back, treated the Picts as a people of the past. They filled the silence with legend, creating stories of conquest and disappearance. These narratives say more about later concerns than early medieval reality. What the evidence supports is a quiet transition. Power moved through familiar families. Language shifted in elite and ecclesiastical contexts. Symbols fell out of use as new ones replaced them. The land and its people persisted without interruption. The change from Pictland to Alba was not marked by collapse or erasure. It was a process of redefinition carried out over generations. The absence of explanation in contemporary sources is itself a clue. For those living through it, the change may not have required comment. The Picts remain identifiable through what they left behind, rather than how they ended. Their name fades from record, but their influence continues within the structures that followed. Alba emerged not from destruction, but from transformation shaped by circumstance, language, and continuity. What survives when names disappear? When the name Pict fades from written record, the material world does not reset. Fields continue to be worked, paths remain in use, and stones stay where they were placed. What changes first is language in documents, not life on the ground. The evidence for continuity appears in ordinary places, embedded in landscape rather than text. Settlement patterns offer one of the clearest indicators. Excavated sites across eastern and northern Scotland show long-term occupation that crosses the 9th century transition without disruption. Roundhouses give way gradually to rectangular buildings in some regions, but the change is uneven and slow. Many construction techniques persist, adapted to new forms rather than replaced. Timber, turf, and local stone remain the primary materials. There is no horizon of abandonment marking a cultural break. Agricultural practice continues with little visible alteration. Crops such as barley and oats remain dominant. Animal husbandry follows established patterns, with cattle maintaining central importance. Field systems show reuse and extension rather than redesign. In some areas, earlier boundaries are respected even when new ownership structures emerge. The land remembers older arrangements, even when political labels shift. Place names preserve deeper layers of continuity. While Gaelic elements spread, especially in administrative and ecclesiastical contexts, older names remain fixed to rivers, hills, and valleys. These names persist because they are functional. They guide movement and orientation. A river does not require renaming to continue flowing. In many cases, new names attach to settlements while older names remain for natural features, creating a layered linguistic map. Religious landscapes also show continuity beneath change. Churches built or rebuilt in the 9th and 10th centuries often stand near earlier sacred sites. Burial grounds remain in use across generations, even as burial practice shifts. The dead are placed among earlier graves, maintaining connection rather than separation. Christian markers increase, but the choice of location reflects long memory rather than new discovery. Stone carving provides a visible measure of transition. The production of Pictish symbol stones ceases, but stone carving itself continues. Cross slabs and later sculpture follow broader insular styles, sharing features with work in Ireland and Northumbria. Craftspeople adapt their skills to new symbolic systems. The disappearance of symbols does not reflect a loss of technical ability. It reflects a change in what needed to be communicated. Metalwork shows similar patterns. Decorative styles evolve, but local production continues. Brooches, pins, and weapon fittings from the early medieval period often combine regional traditions with wider influences. The result is not uniformity but variation within shared frameworks. Objects remain rooted in place even as styles circulate more widely. Legal and social practices are harder to trace, but indirect evidence suggests continuity. Landholding patterns inferred from later documents often align with earlier territorial divisions. Some boundaries used in medieval charters appear to follow much older lines, possibly inherited from Pictish-era arrangements. The persistence of these divisions implies negotiation and adaptation rather than replacement. Memory also survives outside formal record. Later, medieval traditions recall Pictish kings and places, though often distorted by time and legend. While these stories cannot be treated as factual accounts, their existence indicates that the Picts were not forgotten immediately. They remained part of the mental landscape long after their names ceased to appear in official use. The environment itself carries traces of earlier use. Roads, fords, and passes, established in the Pictish period, continue to shape movement. Even when Roman roads fell into disrepair, their routes influenced later travel. Paths follow least resistance lines determined by geography. Political change does not alter hills, rivers, or coastlines. Human movement adapts to these constants. Elite centres also persist in modified form. Sites such as Forteviote and Scone gain prominence in the Kingdom of Alba, but they do not emerge from empty ground. Their earlier importance likely made them suitable for reuse. Authority attaches to places with established significance. New rulers benefit from old associations, even when they reinterpret them. The disappearance of the Pictish name from records reflects the priorities of those writing them. Chroniclers, clerics, and administrators used the language of power, current in their time. As Gaelic-speaking elites came to dominate record-keeping, older labels lost relevance. This shift does not require a change in population to occur. It requires a change in who writes and why. Archaeology does not support large-scale population replacement during the transition. There is no widespread evidence of new settlement types appearing suddenly or older ones vanishing. Burial populations show continuity in physical traits across generations. Material culture shifts gradually, consistent with cultural adaptation rather than displacement. Everyday life likely changed little for most people. Farming routines, seasonal work, and local obligations continued. Authority may have been exercised by different figures, but its immediate impact on daily labour remained limited. The language spoken at court may have changed before the language spoken in fields and homes did. Identity itself is not fixed. People can belong to the same land while being described differently over time. A community that was once called Pictish could later be described as Scottish, without altering its internal practices. Names applied from above do not always align with lived experience below. What survives best are things that did not depend on documentation. Landscapes, tools, settlement sites, and place names carry continuity through periods of political change. These elements outlast kingdoms and labels because they are reused rather than rewritten. The absence of explicit Pictish continuity in later records reflects selective memory. Chroniclers focused on current authority and legitimacy. Earlier identities became background rather than subject. This silence does not indicate disappearance. It indicates integration into a new framework. By the time medieval Scottish identity took clearer shape, the Picts had become a people of the past in written narrative. Their fields, stones, and roots continued to structure life. The foundations they laid supported later developments without acknowledgement. What survives when names disappear is not always visible at first glance. It appears in persistence rather than proclamation. The Picts left no final statement explaining their transition. What they left instead is embedded in the continuity of place. Their legacy is not defined by an ending, but by endurance beneath changing descriptions. The land holds that record more faithfully than texts. How Rome remembered those it could not rule. After Rome withdrew its legions from Britain, the empire did not withdraw its language. These descriptions persisted even as the political reality that produced them no longer existed. Memory outlasted administration. Late Roman and post-Roman texts treat the north as a known uncertainty. Ammianus Marcellinus, writing in the 4th century, described disturbances in Britain involving Picts, Scots, and others as part of a coordinated pressure on Roman defences. His account emphasised movement and disruption rather than identity. The Picts appear as a force acting upon Roman systems, not as a society with internal structure. This framing reflects the author's purpose. He recorded threats to imperial order, not the lives of those beyond it. As direct control ended, classification replaced observation. Roman writers relied increasingly on inherited terms. The label Pict, functioned as a shorthand for northern groups whose actions affected Roman interests. Precision was not required. The name carried enough meaning to situate events geographically and politically. It did not require updating as local realities changed. The late antique habit of compiling lists reinforced this tendency. Texts such as the Notitia Dignitatum catalogued military units and postings, preserving an image of the frontier as it once operated. These documents were administrative in origin, but they took on a retrospective quality as circumstances shifted. The North remained organized on paper long after it ceased to be managed in practice. Latin geographical works also preserved older perspectives. Compilers repeated place names and ethnic terms drawn from earlier sources, often without commentary. The act of copying sustained categories that no longer reflected contemporary conditions. The Picts remained fixed in these works as a people beyond a remembered line, even when that line had lost its function. Christian authors inherited Roman language along with Roman texts. Writers such as Jerome and Orosius referred to Britain in broad terms, noting its distance and former incorporation into the empire. Northern peoples appear as part of the island's margins. Their descriptions rely on Roman precedent rather than new observation. Christianity did not immediately replace imperial geography. It absorbed it. Bede's writing illustrates this continuity clearly. Although he wrote in the early 8th century, long after Roman withdrawal, his framework remained shaped by Roman classification. He divided Britain into peoples and languages using terms inherited from earlier tradition. The Picts appear as one of several distinct groups, defined by territory and speech. Bede's interest lay in ecclesiastical order, but his vocabulary reflects Roman habits of naming and organizing space. In Bede's work, the Picts are not described through custom or law. They are positioned within a moral and theological landscape that assumes older political boundaries. When he recounts conflicts or conversions, he does so using inherited labels that signal difference without elaboration. The Picts remain legible because their name already carried meaning within learned tradition. Later, medieval writers extended this process. Texts produced in Francia, England and Ireland referred to the Picts when recounting earlier events or compiling universal histories. These authors did not expect to verify the term against contemporary reality. The Picts belong to the past, preserved through citation rather than contact. Their name functioned as a stable reference point in a changing world. Roman ethnographic habits shaped how difference was remembered. Northern peoples were often described through contrast with Roman order. They were mobile where Rome was settled, tribal where Rome was administrative, resistant where Rome was authoritative. These oppositions remained embedded in language even when Rome itself was absent. The Picts continued to represent the edge of control. This persistence influenced later legend. Medieval stories describing the Picts often draw on Roman tropes of otherness and antiquity. They appear as ancient inhabitants, sometimes skilled, sometimes strange, but always prior. These narratives do not originate in Pictish tradition. They are constructions built from Roman memory, filtered through centuries of retelling. The idea that Rome could not conquer the Picts also owes much to this remembered framework. Difficult terrain, climate, and supply appear repeatedly as explanations for withdrawal. These themes became fixed in later memory. They framed the Picts as a people defined by resistance rather than by culture. Archaeology complicates this picture without overturning it. Roman material appears north of the walls, but not in forms associated with governance. This absence aligns with Roman descriptions of limits. The empire measured its reach and recorded where it chose not to extend it. That choice became part of how northern peoples were remembered. Memory simplified complexity. The Picts of Roman texts are not divided into regions or lineages. They act as a collective presence. This simplification suited imperial narrative, which favoured clarity over accuracy. Once established, it required no correction. Later writers inherited the collective image without needing to test it. Language itself contributed to this endurance. Latin terms carried authority within scholarly and ecclesiastical circles. Using Roman names lent credibility to new writing. Authors adopted established vocabulary to situate their work within a recognized tradition. Changing the names would have disrupted continuity. Retaining them preserved legitimacy. As the kingdom of Alba emerged, Roman-derived language continued to shape description of the past. Chroniclers, writing about early Scotland, framed earlier centuries using categories inherited from Roman Britain. The Picts became a predecessor, people defined by their place in history rather than their lived reality. Their name marked a temporal boundary as much as a geographic one. This process did not require deliberate distortion. It followed from how knowledge was transmitted. Texts were copied, summarized, and adapted. Each stage favored retention over revision. The farther removed writers were from Roman Britain, the more stable Roman categories appeared. Distance reduced incentive to adjust inherited terms. The result is a layered memory. Roman writers first described the Picts as a problem beyond a frontier. Christian historians placed them within a moral geography inherited from Rome. Medieval chroniclers fixed them in the past as an ancient people. At no point did this memory require engagement with contemporary Pictish life. It relied on continuity of language rather than observation. What Rome remembered about the Picts was shaped by what Rome needed to remember. The empire recorded boundaries, not societies. When its reach ended, its descriptions remained. These descriptions continued to structure understanding long after their practical relevance had faded. The endurance of the Picts in historical writing reflects the power of inherited frameworks. Names persist because they organize knowledge efficiently. Once established, they guide interpretation even when conditions change. The Picts survived in text because Roman language survived as the medium of learning. This remembered image stands alongside material continuity on the ground. While daily life adapted and identities shifted, written memory held older categories in place. The distance between text and lived experience widened over time. The Picts became clearer on the page as they became less visible in life. Rome did not record the end of the Picts because it did not record beginnings either. It recorded limits. Those limits remained meaningful in memory long after they ceased to function in practice. Through that memory, the Picts endured as a people defined by what lay beyond control, what remains when the record falls silent. At the end of the written trail, there is no closing statement. The sources simply thin out. Names appear less often. Descriptions shorten. Eventually, the Picts are no longer identified as a current people. What remains for study is not a final account, but a collection of physical traces that continue to exist without explanation. Archaeology becomes the primary lens at this point, but it does not replace text in the way a document replaces another document. It operates differently. It reveals presence, activity, and continuity, but it does not explain intention. The evidence it provides must be read slowly, with attention to context rather than narrative. Across former Pictish regions, the landscape itself preserves patterns of use that long predate written silence. Field systems visible through aerial photography show long-term organization of land. Some boundaries align with later medieval divisions, suggesting inherited frameworks rather than new planning. These patterns indicate stability in how communities understood and managed space, even as political authority shifted. Excavated settlements from the 9th to 11th centuries rarely show abrupt breaks from earlier occupation. Changes in building form and material occur gradually. New styles appear alongside older ones. This continuity argues against sudden displacement or collapse at the local level. Burial evidence reinforces this picture. Skeletal remains from cemeteries spanning the late Pictish and early Alba periods show no sharp demographic change. Age distribution, health indicators, and physical characteristics remain consistent. These populations lived and died in the same regions across generations. The absence of mass graves or widespread trauma supports a transition without large-scale violence. Material culture follows a similar pattern. Tools, domestic pottery, and agricultural implements evolve slowly. Decorative styles change, but functional objects remain familiar. This suggests adaptation rather than replacement. People adjusted to new cultural frameworks while continuing established practices that met daily needs. Stone monuments provide a visible marker of silence. Pictish symbol stones cease to be produced, but existing stones remain standing. Some are reworked, others ignored, and some incorporated into later structures. Their survival depends more on location than meaning. They persist as objects even when their symbolic language is no longer used. Later communities did not systematically destroy these stones. Their treatment suggests indifference rather than rejection. In some cases, crosses were carved onto earlier stones, integrating them into new religious contexts. In others, stones were reused as building material without regard for their carvings. This range of responses reflects practical decision-making rather than ideological cleansing. The absence of written explanation places limits on interpretation. It cannot record whether people considered themselves Picts, Scots, or something else entirely. Identity is not preserved in soil the way structures are. Landscape archaeology offers another angle. Routeways, river crossings, and coastal landing points continue in use across the transition period. Movement follows geography rather than political labels. These paths connect settlements in ways that outlast kingdoms. Their persistence suggests that economic and social networks remained functional even as names changed. Environmental data also contributes to understanding continuity. Pollen analysis shows long-term patterns of cultivation and grazing. There is no widespread reforestation that would indicate population decline. Instead, land use remains stable, with fluctuations reflecting climate variation rather than social collapse. What archaeology cannot provide is voice. It cannot explain belief, memory, or self-description. It can only indicate that people remained, worked, adapted, and reused what was already present. The silence of the record is not filled by speculation. It is acknowledged as a boundary. Modern interpretations must work within that boundary. Earlier historical writing often attempted to replace silence with certainty, constructing narratives of conquest or disappearance. These narratives relied on later medieval legend rather than contemporary evidence. Archaeology has reduced confidence in such explanations without offering a single alternative story. Instead, understanding now rests on accumulation. Each site adds limited information. Each artifact narrows possibilities without closing them. The picture that forms is partial and uneven, shaped by where excavation occurs and what survives preservation. Absence of evidence remains meaningful, but only when treated cautiously. The transition from Pictland to Alba illustrates this approach. Written sources change their terminology. Material culture changes its emphasis. Settlement continues. None of these elements alone explains the process. Together, they indicate redefinition rather than rupture. The concept of a hidden civilization emerges from this gap. The Picts are not hidden because they vanished, but because they did not leave the kinds of records later societies expect. Their choices favoured stone, land, and repetition over text. When text became dominant, their voice was already absent. This absence shapes modern fascination. The lack of explanation invites projection, but careful study resists that impulse. The goal is not to recover a complete story, but to describe what can be known and where uncertainty remains. What survives best are things that were reused. Land divisions that remained useful. Settlements rebuilt rather than abandoned. Stones left standing because removing them offered no advantage. These elements persist because they continue to function, not because they were preserved intentionally. The silence of the record is not evenly distributed. Elite actions appear briefly in annals. Ordinary lives appear only through material remains. This imbalance reflects who controlled writing rather than who mattered. Archaeology restores some balance by making daily life visible without privileging power. The Picts do not conclude their own history in surviving sources. They do not explain their transition or disappearance. What follows them does not pause to explain either. The shift passes without commentary, because it did not require one at the time. For modern study, this requires restraint. Conclusions must remain provisional. Patterns can be described without assigning motive. Change can be identified without naming cause. This approach respects the limits of the evidence rather than forcing it into narrative shape. The Picts remain present through what they left behind, not through what they said about themselves. Their fields, stones, and settlements persist as the primary record. These elements do not tell a story with a beginning and end. They show continuity across change. When the written record falls silent, history does not stop. it continues in forms that require different methods to read. The Picts are encountered there, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a society understood through endurance rather than explanation. What remains is enough to confirm that they were neither erased nor conquered in the way later legend suggests. It is also enough to show that they did not seek permanence through writing. Their legacy lies in the landscape and in the structures later societies inherited without always recognizing their origin. Silence, in this context, is not absence. It is a condition of survival. The Picts persist where documentation does not. They are known through what endured after names changed. This is where the record ends, not with resolution, but with limits clearly marked. That's all for now. If you want more videos like this, you can subscribe and support the channel. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.